the domestic work industry is the wild, wild west.
There's been a long history of exclusion of domestic work from labor unions.
Domestic workers are real workers.
They were working for dignity and respect.
Black women, the foundation, life at the intersections, source of divine creations. Now listen, now converse.
There have been many instances of organized resistance.
These antiquated labor laws need to be changed.
The bill had to go through 3 legislative cycles before it was finally passed.
Using our labor for more than wages, our bliss, our rage, they're both contagious. Beyond the crime, we move through time. Joy is the compass, we live in our purpose. Telling our own stories, birthing new possibilities.
You are listening to the Black Women's Department of Labor, a project and podcast by yours truly, Taja Lindley, where we examine the intersections of race, gender, and the double entendre of labor to work and to give birth. Welcome to part 2 of our conversation about domestic labor. In our last episode, you met 3 Black women domestic workers and heard their stories of negotiating boundaries, caring for family while providing care as part-time and full-time workers, and some of the challenging realities that domestic workers face while providing their services in private homes. You also got to hear from a woman of color with a disability about her experiences of navigating class dynamics as an employer of domestic workers. In this episode, we're going to examine historical and current organizing strategies of domestic workers in the U.S. and why organizing for dignified and fair labor practices in care work is important. As a reminder, this episode is a collage of excerpts of interviews with our guests. So if you'd like to listen to the full-length interviews and conversations that inform this episode, head on over to patreon.com/Taja Lindley. These recordings are available for all tiers. However, if you join at the creative conversation level or above, you'll be able to access the upcoming Taja Tuesday Artist Talk on September 6th, the day after Labor Day, where I will be sharing more about the process and vision for this podcast. If you're unable to make it to the live virtual event, no worries. It will be recorded and you can watch the replay exclusively on Patreon. Now, let's get into this episode.
I'm from South Africa, and my mother, when she was an older child, had to drop out of school in the 8th grade, and she washed clothes for white families in South Africa as a way to put her brothers through school. And my grandmother worked as a domestic worker for many years in South Africa. So I have a personal connection to the occupation.
That's Pramila Nadesan, a historian who is also deeply committed to economic justice. You heard from her briefly in our last episode when she explained the mammy stereotype. I invited her to be on the podcast because she wrote a book entitled Household Workers Unite: The Untold Stories of African American Women Who Built a Movement. This book documents the history of domestic worker organizing in the mid-20th century.
If our history of domestic work is coming from employers or people with power, we get a very different narrative of that occupation. So my intention was really to uplift and center the voices of domestic workers themselves, especially Black domestic workers. So I looked at oral histories that were done of them. I looked at the archival papers that they kept, although, with poor people in general, especially poor women of color, they tend not to keep their documents. So there are not very good archives. I interviewed people when I could. A lot of people have passed, however, they're hard to find.
Now, before we get into the history of domestic worker organizing that Pramila researched in her book, let's talk a bit about the industry. Who are the folks who work as domestic workers, historically and currently?
Domestic work has always been a very diverse occupation. So in the 19th century, there were a lot of white women who worked as domestic workers as well, mostly European immigrants from Germany, from Ireland. They tended to work as domestics only when they were unmarried. So once they got married, they left the occupation and ended up being full-time housewives. But even apart from them, there were Asian American women, Latinx women, indigenous women who all worked as domestics. But the occupation of domestic work was so closely tied to the history of slavery and the narrative of servitude and the culture of servitude. So it's an occupation that has historically been closely identified with African American women. In 1950, 60% of all domestic workers were African American. So the vast majority. But I also want to say that all women of color in the United States who worked as domestics have all experienced systems of institutionalized coercion. So Indigenous women were taken, young girls actually were taken from their homes in the 19th century and the early 20th century and placed in boarding homes where they were trained as domestic workers for middle class white families who supposedly could help them assimilate. We know that many immigrants who come to this country do so under a system of immigration that coerces them to work for an employer as a domestic worker.
You might remember Allison Julian from our last episode. She came to the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant and worked as a domestic worker for over 25 years. She now works as the We Dream in Black organizing director for the National Domestic Workers Alliance. When I asked her to describe who are domestic workers today, here is what she shared.
So there are over 2.5 million domestic workers in the US, and it's the fastest growing workforce in the coming decade. 91% of domestic workers are women, and more than half of them are women of color. About half of that are undocumented domestic workers. So the median annual earnings of domestic workers is around $18,000, and that's approximately about $12 an hour compared to almost $20 for other workers. So there's a huge comparison in the wages of what domestic workers are making in comparison to other workforces. Domestic workers are 3 times likely to be living in poverty than any other sector of workers. They're dealing with poverty, dealing with food insecurity, dealing with housing insecurity, and there are little to no benefits, including healthcare or paid family care. In the domestic worker industry, these workers are subjected to harassment and discrimination, in particular because of their immigration status.
What Allison shared here is really important, and I want to go on a slight tangent to highlight the class dynamics and financial precarity that domestic workers face. Rose Gloria, a 30-something nanny who came on the podcast anonymously to protect her identity, was featured in our last episode in part 1 of this series. During our interview, she shared some of the economic challenges that nannies face today and how nannies navigate the workforce to best support them financially and to access health care. Namely, choosing when and how to work on or off the books.
So on the books, meaning that, you pay taxes, the entire part of your pay is taken out just like it would be if you worked at a local gym or if you worked at a school. Typically, on the books also means that you're being paid by check most of the time. Off the books is like that you're not paying taxes, you get cash. Most families did a combination on the books and off the books. So half is on the books, but most of the nannies and caregivers appreciate when there's enough to show that you're working, but not enough to take you out of getting other support, like staying on Medicaid, especially if some of these jobs aren't offering health insurance.
And while what Rose described may appear to be a solution to navigating low-wage work and taxes, it also creates some precarious financial relationships, situations, and attitudes between domestic workers and their employers.
And it'd be a situation where, the child would go to some event and everyone's getting an ice cream. Now everyone's getting a book at the bookstore, and now everyone's getting this, and now we're going to lunch, and now I'm at $50. $100 spending for these kids in the day, and the reimbursement doesn't come for another week because mom forgot. That happened often. Sometimes I was caught paying for full blown tennis lessons that were $500. And the tennis coach would be like, hey, I can't start this until I get paid. And I would have no option but to pay because the child's crying because they want to do tennis and I've got to pick up the brother in the next hour. And, situations that could have been totally avoided. If we go to a hotel and there's no food there, obviously, I'm supposed to provide them food, and they're not answering their cell phones or text messages. I have to figure something out. That type of dilemma is really common.
These on and off the book payments can also create situations that have the potential for abuse and underpaying domestic workers.
If you get hired around the holidays, negotiating is very different because one, there's Christmas bonuses, which are a big, big deal. If you feel like leaving your job as a domestic worker, you don't do it near the holidays because that is when everyone's on their best behavior. Because Christmas bonus is like you get half of your pay for the year. Some people do at the least 2 weeks of pay for your bonus. For many people, that means Christmas gifts for their family. That means food for their family to celebrate the holidays. So a lot of families bank on that and they'll negotiate around the holidays differently because it'll be like, well, why don't we just do 20 an hour? You can take as many breaks as you want. It's really your vacation too, especially if we go away somewhere. It's your vacation too, and I give really good Christmas bonuses. But then they'll create a schedule for you where you're literally working from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. with no break. By the time you look up to say something, the vacation's over or the contract's over.
Many of these issues that Allison and Rose Gloria mentioned have been ongoing dilemmas and circumstances that domestic workers have faced in the United States. Let's get into a brief history of domestic labor and the folks who organize this workforce.
Sometimes domestic work is considered or has historically been considered by historians, especially labor historians, as an unorganizable occupation, as one in which people simply couldn't organize or didn't organize, didn't have the power to, didn't have the desire to. And part of the claim that I was trying to make, and I'm not the only historian to do this, others have done it as well, but is to really foreground how domestic workers have in fact been resisting and have always resisted. There's two kinds of organizing that domestic workers have engaged in. One is more informal or day-to-day organizing. Domestic workers would pan-tote, which means that they would take things. These are people who are getting paid very little for their labor. And so they might see something in their employer's home that they think could help compensate for their low wages. That is a form of resistance. Or quitting. They have dealt with enough from an employer and they'll just say, enough is enough, I'm leaving. Or work slowdowns, where they're expected to do way more than employer ever asked them to do. And so they might just slow down their pace of work. So these are acts of resistance that people sometimes engage in when they're not able to organize collectively. But in addition to that, there have been many instances of organized resistance. One of the earliest cases that's been documented by the historian Tara Hunter, who's at Princeton, is the Washing Society in Atlanta, which organized in 1881. And these were African American women who washed clothes for a living, who would often do takeout work. That is, they would collect the clothes on a Saturday and take it home and wash all the clothes and return it the following weekend. And they were paid very little for this labor. But they organized in the city of Atlanta in 1881 and hugely successful at really mobilizing people, not just domestic workers, but the janitors and building service employees. A lot of the working class mobilized and supported them in this strike. And they went on strike for a period of time and managed to raise their rates. So again, it's a really powerful example of how people who one might think of as being relatively powerless are able to collectively come together and wield their power. Then in the 1930s, there was organizing as well across the country by domestic workers. This was in the midst of the Great Depression, but one of the most well-known cases is a woman, African-American woman in New York, whose name is Dora Jones, and she formed a group called the Domestic Workers Union, and it had a base both in Harlem and in Sunnyside, Queens. They eventually had about 1,000 members, women of African descent and women of Finnish descent from Finland, and they formed a local chapter of the Service Employees International Union. And then the period I write about in the 1960s, there's organizing that's happening all across the country in New York, in San Francisco, in Detroit, in Cleveland, in Atlanta. Many of these domestic workers start organizing in their communities with other women they know. They organize in public places. At the same time, there are middle-class women who are organizing to reform the occupation. So Edith Barksdale Sloan is an African-American woman who heads an organization called the National Committee on Household Employment. She's not a domestic worker herself, but she hires a domestic worker, Josephine Hewlett, who is from Youngstown, Ohio. and she asked Hewlett to be a field organizer. This is in 1971, after people are organizing on the local level. And Hewlett travels around the country to meet all these workers who are organizing, and they bring them together into a national organization, the Household Technicians of America. And this is such an important organization because it is the first time that there is a national domestic workers organization in this country, where local chapters from around the country, local groups from around the country are able to connect in some kind of national formation and speak in a national collective voice. So I think it's a really critical turning point in the history of organizing. And they have, by 1972, about 25,000 members.
So now we know a bit about who is organizing, as well as where and why they're organizing. But how do domestic workers organize in a labor market that was once considered a quote unquote unorganizable workforce?
Usually, when we think about, especially labor organizing, but any kind of organizing, right, that happens in collective workplaces. So the models of labor organizing are people are talking to one another on an assembly line or in the break rooms or as they're going into work in the morning. But domestic workers are a dispersed workforce, so they couldn't do that. They didn't have an assembly line. They were working in most cases as single employees in an isolated household behind closed doors, and nobody might have even known that they worked there. So it has been an occupation historically that has been hard to organize, but they were able to do so nonetheless. And they did so by turning to public spaces for organizing. So they organized in buses, that is, city buses. They organized in playgrounds. They organized in supermarkets. One of the workers I write about, Carolyn Reed, who organized in the 1970s in New York, she would go into the gourmet shops where she shopped for her employers and saw other domestic workers. She would organize at the laundry rooms. She has a wonderful quote where she's talking about the history of the occupation, and she says, household workers have not been selling their services, they've been selling their souls. Dorothy Bolden, who lived in Atlanta, she actually began domestic work when she was 9 years old. And she lived in Vine City, the same area where Martin Luther King lived. And she knew King. King is actually one of the people who encouraged her to organize domestic workers. And Bolden used the bus system to organize. And so she rode the city buses. She traveled from one end of the city to the other. She handed out leaflets. She talked to women about the occupation, encouraged them to join her organization, and, tried to empower them to make a change. There was a transfer point. So Atlanta's a segregated city. And so African-American women would board the buses in the Black neighborhoods and go downtown, where they transferred to the buses that would take them to the white neighborhoods where they worked. Julian Bond referred to this transfer point as a meeting ground, and said that Dorothy Bolden was at the center of it. So that kind of became her hub of organizing. And so I think this shift from sort of private spaces of organizing to public spaces of organizing was really critical in terms of how domestic workers could mobilize other women.
Community organizing begins with recruitment, reaching out to people who have shared experiences and or identities. Next comes political education, providing opportunities for the folks who were recruited to situate their individual experiences into a bigger picture, identifying how power operates in the systems and structures that created cause for their gathering.
Once people were recruited, they were able to get together in these other meeting spaces, and those became the real sites of political education, where people could talk about what their long-term experiences had been, what their goals for the future were, what kinds of strategies they would implement. So they had national gatherings once the Household Technicians of America, the HTA, was formed, and they were able to come together with other women around the country to begin to talk about bigger political strategy and how their local organizing would connect to that bigger political strategy.
These political and organizing strategies were informed by practices of storytelling.
The idea that domestic workers were a constituency or a unified group wasn't necessarily a given. So they had to work to build that sense of community. Learning about and getting to know other domestic workers was absolutely critical to the success of this movement. One of the ways that happened was to begin to share stories. Edith Barksdale Sloan, who was the head of the National Committee on Household Employment, Josephine Hewlett, Carolyn Reed, all the women I've talked about, when they began to talk about their experience as domestic workers, how difficult it was to take care of their children, something their employers did to them. Other domestic workers would begin to identify with them, would understand that, would say, oh, yes, I had a similar experience as well with my employer. And so that was the beginnings of building a community, which lays the foundation for building a movement. So those stories that they told really served as a recruitment tool. It relied a lot on their personal experiences, but it also relied on history. But one of the stories about storytelling that most resonated with me was about Geraldine Miller. She moved to New York from Kansas in the 1950s. And when she was living in New York City, she heard about these things called slave markets. And slave markets existed in the 1930s, and they were street corners where African American women would wait to be hired as day laborers, as domestic workers in the homes of white families. These women were exploited or mistreated, were underpaid. Two African American women journalists, Ella Baker and Margot Cook, wrote about them and about the underpayment, about how sometimes they wouldn't get paid at all. And so Miller heard about these slave markets. She didn't experience them herself, but she heard about them. And what she heard is that employers in the 1930s would look for women with the most scarred knees, because women with the most scarred knees were the ones who would scrub the floor on their hands and knees. And Miller would tell this story to other domestic workers in the 1960s and 70s, partly as a way to tell them we should never, ever have to scrub the floor on our hands and knees. So her telling of this story was both about creating community and creating identity and building a movement, but it was also about establishing a standard by telling other workers that we need to draw our line somewhere. And this is one place that we can draw the line.
Domestic workers employed these strategies to organize for dignified labor conditions. They did this through shifting the narrative about what domestic labor is and shifting laws that excluded domestic workers from labor protections. Here are some of the demands and goals of domestic workers who organized in the 60s and 70s.
One of the key campaigns was for labor protections. So domestic workers, like other, especially agricultural workers, were excluded from key provisions of labor protections that were passed in the 1930s. For example, the Fair Labor Standard Act, the Social Security Act, the National Labor Relations Act. So the National Labor Relations Act gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. The Social Security Act, of course, gave people Social Security. And domestic workers by the 1970s were included in the Social Security Act because it was a change that was made in 1950. But they were still excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, which meant that they were not guaranteed minimum wage or overtime pay. Domestic work was a very low-paid occupation, and people simply needed more money to live on. So inclusion of domestic workers into the Fair Labor Standards Act became a focal point of organizing for domestic workers in the 60s and 70s. So these were the kind of immediate demands and outcomes, but I think that more broadly, they were really working for dignity and respect. They wanted to really transform the occupation of domestic work and move it away from this culture of servitude, from the way in which the nanny stereotype dominated the occupation. And they wanted employers to see them as professional workers. In fact, they didn't call themselves domestic workers. They called themselves household technicians. And that renaming was really important because they didn't want to be at the beck and call of their employers. They didn't want to be called by their first names. And employers would often call their workers girl or make up some name for them that they had no connection to. And so they wanted to be seen and respected as workers who deserved the same rights and respect as all other workers. So people wanted clearly defined work requirements and clearly defined breaks and benefits. So one of the things they fought for was a contractual relationship. So when they were hired, that a contract would be drawn up that would specify what their rights and responsibilities were.
Domestic workers were excluded from both legislated labor protections and labor unions that were organizing for fair labor practices, except for domestic workers.
There's been a long history of exclusion of domestic work from labor unions. And most labor unions, even in the 1960s, simply did not want to organize domestic workers. They were not supportive. And this is a time when there is an upsurge of labor organizing. They're organizing nurses and they're organizing teachers. Lots of service sector workers in the 1960s are beginning to come together. But labor unions don't provide support for domestic workers. And they know about what's happening. Domestic workers reach out to them, but they're just not interested. So there's been a history of marginalization, a history of exclusion. And I think in some ways, that created an opportunity for workers to form their own movement and to define their own struggle. So, in some ways, I think it was actually a good thing. Domestic workers were more along the model of social movement unionism, which is a term that has developed more recently since the 1990s about how workers can organize more as a movement than as a union membership organization. So they use all kinds of mobilization strategies as opposed to just you pay your dues and then we bargain on your behalf with your employer. So it was about building solidarity, about building community, about grassroots struggle, more so than just bargaining with an employer.
It's both ironic and deeply enraging that domestic workers were marginalized in a movement that had clear shared interests, though perhaps different strategies for reaching their goals. And labor organizing wasn't the only movement space that had some tensions with domestic worker organizing. The women's movement and feminism movement could have been better allies to support domestic workers, especially since so many domestic workers were women. But rather than finding shared struggle and collective power based on issues of gender, middle-class white women found themselves at odds with the goals of domestic worker organizing.
The women's movement had a profound impact on domestic work and on domestic worker organizing. For mostly middle-class white women who organized in the 60s, feminism or liberation was defined as getting a job outside the home, was leaving the home and taking employment. And so a critical question for them was, okay, who's going to do the housework? And so these middle class women turned to hire domestic workers to fill in that household gap, to bring in people, to hire poorer women, women of color, to do the work in the household that they were not able to do since they were taking jobs outside the home. And so there's a direct correlation, I argue, between the quote unquote liberation of white middle class women and the growing exploitation of women of color, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. Even though in the 1970s there were a lot of declarations or predictions that domestic work was on the decline and there would be an ultimate demise of the occupation, that is actually not what happened. You see after the 1970s an expansion in the number of domestic workers who are hired. And that's because of more and more middle-class women who are entering the workforce.
This, too, is ironic and deeply enraging that the concept of liberation for white women required the servitude of Black women and other women of color. And the notion that women's liberation would be achieved with entering the workforce, with labor, totally erased the historical and current experiences of Black women's labor in the United States. You'll remember from our first episode this season, Jennifer Morgan discussed how African women were gendered as laborers. And this gendering was part of the justification of slavery. So while white middle-class women were yearning to work, we can't say the same for Black women who had been forced into slavery and coerced into low-wage jobs. It's no accident that many white feminists in the 60s and 70s had this cognitive dissonance.
So domestic work was integrally tied to the production of white supremacy and racialized hierarchy in the United States. And for domestic workers, I think especially in the 1960s, modern day racism for them was symbolized not by the segregated lunch counter, but by the figure of the nanny. So it was those daily acts of having to enter through the back door, the requirement to wear a uniform or to serve at the beck and call of their employer, that for them manifested as racism.
And while employers were a group of folks that domestic workers struggled to hold accountable, there were some employers who participated in this social movement with a wide range of intentions.
I think there's a difference between employers wanting improvement in the occupation and employers supporting domestic workers in organizing, because there were many employers who advocated improvement in the occupation. And the reason they advocated improvement in the occupation was because they wanted better workers. They wanted a more stable supply of workers. It was really about self-interest. interest. And then there are employers who do, in fact, support worker organizing and who I think are deeply committed to it, perhaps for the right reasons. And so this movement in the 1970s did have employers who were standing by, standing next to, and advocating on behalf of domestic workers. And I think had it not been for the assistance of some of those employers, it would have been much harder for domestic workers to pass the Fair Labor Standards Act amendment that did eventually give them minimum wage.
There is so much more to the history of domestic worker organizing. I encourage you to read Pramila's book, as well as join my Patreon to hear the rest of our interview. Now let's get into present-day organizing. Allison's story of how she came to the National Domestic Workers Alliance is a beautiful example of how community organizing supports both the individual and the industry.
I got involved in domestic worker organizing April of 2002. I was working on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, providing care for a young girl at the time. And in the park, I was outreached to by Poo, who is now the executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. When I learned that there was a body of domestic workers organizing, I knew nothing of the concept of organizing and what that meant, but I knew it was something that I wanted to be a part of.
The organization that Allison joined in 2002 was Domestic Workers United, based in New York. Allison was at a national gathering in 2007 that formed the National Domestic Workers Alliance, with a group of approximately 50 domestic workers from 13 organizations around the country.
And in 2015, I was awarded the Dorothy Bolden Fellowship out of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I was speechless because I felt at this point in my life, I was doing the two things that I enjoyed. I was volunteering full time as a domestic worker, and I was working full time as a domestic worker. And I felt like I was doing the two things that mattered most to me because I could take the advocacy that I was learning in the streets back into my workplace to educate my employers. And so when I was awarded the fellowship, I then had to make a decision on one, what does having a fellowship mean? And then two, what does this mean for my career as a domestic worker? I remember like building up the courage to go to my employers to say to them, like, hey, look, I'm done. And it was hard because I had at this point been working with this family for 5 years. I had helped them raise two of their kids. The kids and I had a great relationship. They challenged me every single day. And I was like, okay, I am ready to pivot into something new. So I joined NDWA in January of 2016 as a Dorothy Bolden Fellow, one of the two Dorothy Bolden Fellows. If someone had ever told me that this was the way that my life was going to change and I was going to be a part of making history and be a newer version of Dorothy Bolden and the visions that Dorothy Bolden had for domestic workers, I would never have envisioned that. After my fellowship ended, I became the lead organizer for We Dream in Black to bring Black domestic workers from across the diaspora together. I went on 2 years later to become the New York co-director. And most recently, I am now the We Dream in Black organizing director, really holding space for our We Dream in Black chapters across the country in North Carolina, Georgia, Philadelphia, and New York City.
This work with Black domestic workers specifically is part of how Allison and NDWA is acknowledging and addressing the legacy of slavery that shows up in domestic work.
I feel like a lot of the work that I have done as a domestic worker and that other domestic workers do is really honoring that legacy of slavery. And a part of the work we do is really paying homage to these ancestors. And as far as we have come from slavery, is the way that many people still see domestic workers today is that the work that they do is very similar to the work that our ancestors or the work that slaves did. Oftentimes, employers, I believe, feel that they can get away with treating domestic workers like less than because they're the help or they're just here to care for my kids. But domestic work is real work. and should be treated with dignity and respect, regardless to what language they speak, regardless to their immigration status, regardless to their class or their race or their gender or their sex.
So, what is the National Domestic Workers Alliance up to?
The National Domestic Workers Alliance is the leading voice for dignity and fairness for millions of domestic workers in the United States, the majority of whom are immigrant women of color. NDWA works for respect, recognition, inclusion, and labor protections for domestic workers. And today we have about 75 affiliate organizations that make up the body of the National Domestic Workers Alliance in around 20 states where there are nannies, house cleaners, and care providers that make up the body of domestic workers. So since 2010, we've been able to win Bill of Rights, starting out with New York. We've gone on to win in California, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Oregon, Nevada, Illinois, Connecticut, New Mexico, and Virginia, not to forget in Seattle and Philadelphia.
In our last episode, you heard from an employer, Nikki Brown Booker, a woman of color with a disability who hires domestic workers to support her day-to-day activities. Nikki participated in the organizing efforts in California.
I heard about this organization called the Hand in Hand, the Domestic Employers Network, and that there was a newly formed group of employers that really wanted to make a difference in this market, this labor market. So we started getting together and talking about the frustrations and the challenges and tensions, and we decided, we need to start organizing. I'm in California. I worked on the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights here in California. It was a hard fought battle. The bill had to go through 3 legislative cycles before it was finally passed. When it was passed, we did get overtime pay for domestic workers. So that was kind of locally in California. And I started realizing that this is something that's a national problem. So with Hand in Hand and the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we really started putting some pressure on federal legislative bodies, and we're able to get the Fair Labor Standards Act to actually adopt some overtime and change their rules around domestic workers.
These Bill of Rights are a set of laws to ensure that domestic workers have fair and dignified places and experiences of work.
We oftentimes say the domestic work industry is like the Wild Wild West, where employers literally get to determine the working conditions. They're the judge and the jury, and that's the end. But these domestic worker Bill of Rights really gives protection for the domestic workers, and it also provides guidelines for employers so they understand what their responsibilities are as domestic employers. And some of these laws across the country vary in terms of the protection for overtime, making sure that domestic workers are paid overtime after 40 hours. Some states may have time off for pregnancy so that the domestic worker who is having a child can have that time home to care for their child, rightfully so. There's also protection with time off for rest or vacation time or sick time that's included. It's important to know that without these protections, that we've seen within the industry that employers really decide for themselves what they want, how many days they're given off, how many days they're given for vacation, if there's pregnancy time, yes or no. Another important thing that I want to note is the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights across the country include domestic workers who are undocumented. Oftentimes we have the question about documentation. Well, if the domestic worker is undocumented, they shouldn't be working. We can definitely get into that immigration piece as a whole other segment. But if they are doing the work, they do deserve the protections regardless if they're documented or not. Undocumented workers need these protections in place so that their rights are not violated, because they do have human rights and they should be treated, all domestic workers should be treated with dignity and respect. I think of myself when I started doing domestic work, I didn't have these protections. And when I was able to fight for, as a part of the New York Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, fight for and win these protections with domestic workers, I felt like that was the time where I could say my work shifted. That was when I felt like I I had superpowers because now I had protection as a domestic worker. I felt like my work now finally mattered. These antiquated labor laws need to be changed. Domestic workers are real workers, and their work should be valued and respected and treated with the same level of care as every other profession there is across this country.
In addition to organizing around state and federal labor laws, NDWA is also shifting the culture and narrative around care work. Like the domestic workers and organizations that Pramila mentioned earlier, NDWA is professionalizing the industry, so domestic labor is taken just as seriously as any other occupation.
As I got involved in domestic worker organizing, we were really using the term domestic worker and really lifting up the value of a domestic worker and who a domestic worker was. So we named domestic workers as nannies, care providers to the elderly and disabled, and house cleaners. And I felt when I walked into work and I said to an employer, I am a professional nanny, they treated me with a different sense of respect than they did when I said I was a babysitter. And as I learned that the shift in the way that I presented myself as a professional care provider was really important to the way that employers saw me and the way that they valued the work that I brought in. This is the way that we communicate that with domestic workers in our community. We professionalize this industry. It's a very important industry. I oftentimes say domestic workers are the most brilliant set of individuals you would ever meet. Because what a lot of us tend to forget is before domestic workers migrate to the US to work as domestic workers, they were professionals in their home countries. Many of them are formally trained. They have trainings in early childhood education. They're trained in child psychology. They're CPR and first aid certified. They're trained as house cleaners or home health aides. And what they bring into the work beyond the heart and beyond the care, many of them bring a second or a third language. Many of them bring the culture through the foods that they're able to cook for the kids. Many of them bring song and dance from their backgrounds. And a part of our organizing is really to ensure that not only do domestic workers see themselves as professionals, but society as a whole and employers as a whole see them in that way.
And while many domestic workers bring additional skill sets with them to their work, professionalization of the industry means also making distinctions between services. When those distinctions are not clear, it can create what Allison calls the nanny and problem.
Many domestic workers start out in one profession. We go in, let's say, as the nanny, and within a year or 2 years, we become the nanny and everything else, the dog walker, the elder care provider, the house cleaner, the laundry washer. It's an unfair disadvantage for many domestic workers because many of them feel they have to do the work in order to keep the job. And this is for employers who are listening, if you hire a nanny, respect that they are nannies. They're not nannies and unless you're willing to compensate for the additional service you're asking for, respect that caring for a child it takes a lot of patience, takes a lot of time, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of skill, and definitely takes a lot of heart. So you can't be providing care for a child and cleaning the windows at the same time. And I think those distinctions within the industry need to be super clear. And it's something, one, that employers need to think about when they're in the hiring process. Who do I really need in my house? Is it a nanny? Is it a house cleaner? Is it an elder care provider? And for nannies or professional domestic workers, they also need to be clear about their role. What is my role as a domestic worker? Am I the nanny and the house cleaner, or am I the nanny Monday through Friday? I could be your house cleaner. That's going to be a separate cost on a separate day. So these lines of communication need to be extremely clear in the relationship between employers and employees.
Rose Gloria shared a lot in the last episode about being the nanny and. Sometimes it was her choice, sometimes it was the agency that lied about the gig, and sometimes the families that employed her overstepped her boundaries. She talks more in our 2.5-hour interview on Patreon about other instances of this that we did not have space to include in this series. But what I want to get to here is, why does this happen? Why are domestic workers expected to do more labor than they were hired to take on?
When we think of gender, work and the roles that gender play in our society. Women's work in the home is undervalued, it's unpaid, right? The mother of two kids taking care of the house or the partner cleaning and cooking, oftentimes there's no pay for that. It's the expectation that women across the globe are supposed to maintain the homes. And when we think of that narrative in the domestic worker workplace, it almost feels like it has that same expectation. Employers feel like the women who are doing domestic work is supposed to do this labor for free. And no, this is paid work. It is labor. They should be compensated fairly.
In addition to gendered notions of what labor is and how it's valued, Pramila also situates the devaluation of domestic labor within a broader understanding of how we collectively define and view paid labor in the economy.
Labor is often associated with working in a factory, producing a good, making something, creating something. And household labor and care work has often been considered outside of that. It's not considered productive labor in quite the same way. People sometimes think about household labor or the work of domestic labor as kind of unnecessary, like we could live without it, right? It doesn't really matter that much. And we know from the pandemic how important it is, right? And how so many things shut down. People couldn't go to work when they didn't have childcare. But Carolyn Reed said in the 1970s about the power that she was talking about labor organizing and the power that domestic workers had. And she said they have a tremendous amount of power because, quote, the houses could not run. You could never know how helpless people can be, especially wealthy people, until you've worked in their homes. Just one day of true hardship or true inconvenience, and they'd won a bargain.
This makes me think of the refrain that NDWA says often, that domestic labor makes all other work possible. And even though care work is important, it's often not valued or compensated accordingly. And speaking of the pandemic, NDWA had to shift its activities and organizing practices when COVID hit. In a time when we were being encouraged to socially distance from one another, it put the domestic labor workforce in a precarious situation.
So, right before we heard of the coronavirus in the US, the National Domestic Workers Alliance had just had our national gathering of over 1,000 domestic workers. It was our biggest gathering of domestic workers across the country. And then we got to March. And we learned of the pandemic, and we knew very early on that domestic workers were going to be significantly impacted by the pandemic. Domestic work is not work that's outsourced. It's not work that can be done from home. After that 2-week time period passed, and we got into April, domestic workers were recognizing, well, they were sent home, which meant they were not being paid for the time home. Many of them became unemployed, and rent is due. We saw a huge percentage of our workers feeling like it was really the end. They didn't know what to do. There was no income coming in. The conversation about poverty really kicked in quickly. And very early, workers were feeling the stress of the inability to pay rent. Maybe they made April rent, but May and June came around, and that became so hard for so many domestic workers. What we also saw were many employers were migrating across the country or out of the country, even. So these jobs now are permanently lost. And workers had no place to go. Many of them do not collect unemployment. So unemployment was not an option. The stimulus package was not an option for many domestic workers. Most of them already weren't receiving paid time off. And a part of what we've done as the National Domestic Workers Alliance, we had what we called our Coronavirus Care Fund, where there were donations that were made by the community, by the foundations, and distributed over $30 million that was raised in cash assistance for domestic workers. Those funds were lifesavers for many domestic workers. And we were also able to provide PPE for many domestic workers who were going into work and didn't have access to PPE because many employers were not providing PPE. As an organization, we're glad that we were able to provide some level of relief for domestic workers across the country. And in our organizing work, we shifted from our in person meetings or our in person events to doing everything virtually. It's been a challenge. It's been exciting and it's been a challenge because now we're teaching workers how to use Zoom. First, we had to teach them what Zoom was and then what it is and how to access it and how to use the mute and the camera on button. It is so refreshing to see that our workers have caught up. Many of them have learned how we could be a part of community with each other in this virtual way. Being in this community has really shown us where our power is, right? Like we're able to reach more workers, and it comes with its challenges because not everyone has access to a smartphone. Not everyone can download Zoom and knows how to use it. And that's the part of our community we're still figuring out. How do we stay in contact? And I'm so glad that telephones didn't become extinct because we can still call the workers who may have challenges with technology to be in communication with them.
In our last episode, Rose Gloria shared a very wild story about navigating work during the pandemic. I encourage you to listen to her full story on Patreon to hear other ways that this pandemic, namely the vaccine mandates, has impacted her health and her work. You also heard from Adela Seeley, a professional nanny from St. Lucia living in New York, mother of 7 children, and a member of NDWA. She, too, experienced some shifts in her work over the last couple of years due to COVID.
When the city shut down, my employers lived in the hot zone in New York. There was like this zone that nobody was allowed to enter or leave. And one of my employers, 2 weeks into discovering COVID, she lost her form of employment. And I remember asking her, does that mean I won't be able to work with you anymore? And she said, no, we're going to keep you as long as we can afford. So that was a relief when she said that, because I knew there were so many nannies that were just losing their jobs. Their work family just got up and left, and they had no recourse. They didn't know where they would get their next paycheck or anything like that. So when she said that, I was relieved. And then the city shut down. Public transportation was really limited. And she asked me to live with them, so become a live-in. I was like, I'll think about it. Then she said, oh, but Malik can come with you, because then they were doing school remotely. When she said that, I was like, okay, then I would do it. And we were living with extended family at the time. So I figured then Malik is the last one, the youngest one. I was comfortable enough to go do living with Malik. So that's what we did. She would pick me up on a Monday morning and drop me off on a Friday afternoon. So for like maybe 6 months, I was doing living. I had to make sure I call my older kids to get up and sign on for school, because then nobody's in a rush to get up because we're not leaving the house.
Language, the words we choose to use when talking about domestic labor, is important for folks who do the work as well as the folks who organize the laborers. We discussed earlier how professionalization of the domestic labor workforce is often found in word choice, like referring to people as nannies instead of babysitters. There's also some conversation and concern about referring to this work as care work.
I'm actually currently working on a book about care and care work and how we understand care work and how we talk about care work. And one of the things I learned from my writing about domestic workers is that they often didn't refer to this labor as care work. They talked about it in terms of domestic work or household technician work. And I think that the language of care that is so prevalent today imposes a kind of emotional demand on workers that is unjust and characterizes people as carers as opposed to workers, and elides the question of rights and of the question of pay and the question of working conditions. And so the domestic workers in the 60s and 70s didn't talk about their jobs as care. They didn't see themselves as caring for people. They saw themselves as workers. And so I think we can go back and we can think about the importance of how we want to consider workers vis-a-vis their employment relationship and not just their care relationship.
This emotional demand of care work showed up for Rose Gloria when she took care of her employer's children.
Personal space is really not a thing with this job. It's very difficult to maintain. You really have to place a lot of boundaries in. And a lot of the families I noticed, you'll get hired more frequently and you're more appreciated and valued when you give up your personal space. I never got really good at setting boundaries around personal space because I always felt so much for the children, especially when you have children that are deprived of that type of nurturing. And I felt so much for them wanting that connection and wanting a hug, wanting to be able to lay and cuddle up while watching a movie. That's so important. And I've worked with so many children that really didn't get that from their parents.
And when her employer saw this connection Rose had with their children, it caused some tension and created some awkward situations.
Sometimes the kids would ask questions about me and they would say, "Oh, do you have any sisters or brothers?" And I would talk about how I was the oldest in my family. And oftentimes the mom would chime in and say something like, "Well, so am I." Those moments, or if a child called me mommy by accident, which happened a lot, or if a child wanted me to do bath time versus mommy, then it was a big competition. So there was this nature of like this competitive, but then like disconnect because sometimes the mom wouldn't even want to give the child a bath because they needed to go to work or wanted to go do something else. But because she was supposed to, that was supposed to be her job, and she didn't, then it became a fight. So it was like this like conflict that was conjured all the time, but not real conflict because she didn't even want to be present that way. But she knew she was supposed to be present, and I was in the way.
Wow. We have covered so much ground in these 2 episodes. I feel like our guests shared so much insight and raised many questions for us to sit with. So I don't have too much else to say, except that I want to leave you with these words from Adela.
As nannies, home caregivers, and house cleaners, we are often not given the respect that we deserve because our job is not seen as a profession, although it is a job that entails caring for your most treasured belongings, being your children, your homes, or your parents. We deserve being paid a living wage so that we can take care of our families, sending our children to enrichment classes or great schools, so we don't have to choose between food and medication, and we can afford to provide a home for our family where we feel comfortable and safe. Domestic workers deserve to be treated as any other profession. Our work is the silk thread that holds all other work together. Domestic workers make all other work possible.
I give thanks for your time, attention, and listenership. If you're enjoying your experience, tell a friend and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts or on our website. If you'd like to share your story or perspective with us, write us a message or leave us a voicemail at blackwomensLabor.com. Find us on Instagram at blackwomensLabor and sign up for our newsletter to receive project updates in your inbox. And support this work, y'all, at patreon.com/Taja Lindley, where you will be able to access exclusive content and full-length interviews with each of our guests, including everyone you heard from in this episode. You can also support this podcast by dropping some coins in our PayPal or purchasing the podcast music on colorgirlshustle.bandcamp.com. This podcast is created and hosted by yours truly, Taja Lindley, also known as the HBIC. Audio engineering by Lilah Larson. Music by Emma Alabaster, who also served as the pre-production associate producer. Additional music production by Chip Belton. Vocals by Patience Sings. Mixing and mastering by Chip Belton. Lyrics by Taja Lindley and Emma Alabaster. Logo and graphic design templates by Homegirl HQ. This podcast is produced by Color Girls Hustle and supported by the Economic Hardship Reporting Project.